Hey, you executives out there that are scaling your business, you're probably running into some of the natural challenges that come with it. How do you unite everyone? How do you keep calm and focus? How do you get everybody marching in the direction that you have in your vision? And that's the argument for applying a business operating system to your organization. The question is, which one's right for you? And is it really necessary? That's why we've invited Scott Levy from ResultMaps to come and discuss that exact subject. They've created an incredible system, but he's also got a great collection of hot sports opinions on just the entire planning process. I think you're going to love it. I'm Bryon Morrison. Welcome to the Leaders List. Scott Levy, welcome to the Leaders List. We're so thrilled to have you here.
I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, well, listen, it's interesting because the subject that we're talking about today is business operating systems, or your boss in some cases. And you might have expected us to invite, a behavioral scientist or, an EOS implementer or somebody who just deals with that. And Scott, I immediately thought of you because of what you've done with ResultMaps and the systems behind that, because I think that's so important. And you bring all of those things together because you're just a student of it. So I'd love for you to give a little bit of background on yourself, on ResultMaps. How did you get to this place?
Yeah, I appreciate that. The way ResultMaps came about, we call it strategy execution software because that's the moniker that the industry gives it. And what I found myself doing was helping lots of organizations, CEOs, leaders, investors actually execute their strategies. And there's a whole set of things that goes into that. And strategy execution was the way to encapsulate that. But there's a lot of fundamentals that go into doing that. And that's what business operating systems help you do. But over time, we realized the easiest way to get people to think about improving strategy execution was to meet them where they were. So if they're implementing a business operating system, we help them do that because the principles are the same. So business operating system just ends up being kind of a bucket that all these different principles get lumped into to help people understand them, because an operating system is something that a lot of people can wrap their head around. But yeah, so ResultMaps itself, we're strategy execution software that helps leaders get complete visibility into everything that's going on in the organization, helps them create rapid results with whatever they're trying to do, whether it's grow the business, set the business up for acquisition. We help them get those results without disrupting operations. We give them comprehensive support for their entire team without any excuses, and we help them create agile, aligned engagement without micromanaging their people. So they don't have a bunch of bureaucracy or tool overwhelm. They're just getting the right things done. That's us.
I remember when you guys just first got started, and you are just such a natural consultant and supportive individual that I know you were focused on tools to facilitate operating systems. But yet you still got drawn into, helping and consulting because it's just who you are, right?
Totally. I had been doing so much consulting in the years prior that a lot of times people were hiring me just to help them understand these things, or most often it would be, hey, we have this project and we can't afford for it to fail, or the business is stalled here and we need to get it past this inflection point. And what I was seeing over and over, and the reason I turned that into software, is you're kind of doing the same things over and over and over. And I am a software guy. So anything that could be automated and systematized, we did. And where that set us up to be different than what I think is out there today is we really focused on the areas where vendors just weren't playing. Visibility, improving communication, improving trust. Like those three things just get totally thrown out the window because everybody's like, oh, well, we'll make these PDFs into software, or we'll make your goal tracking just like your Gantt charts. And so part of it was I was systematizing that, but then people also need help understanding, what are these principles? How do I make sense of them? You have some people that they jump on the bandwagon for one or another business operating system, and that's all they need. We're very interested in making sure that you get adoption all the way down the organization. A lot of times with these business operating systems, what I see is it's just the leadership team, or it's just like a couple people on the leadership team. And we found that we can get 80% deeper adoption if we just help people understand. And that makes life better for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I always said that you were a proxy before we started Proxxy.
Right on.
Because you're a problem solver, right? And we saw the same thing as we looked at organizations. So many of them had adopted some sort of a business operating system, but
Mhm.
were having trouble implementing it. And what we always found is that there were two missing components. One is the person with the discipline who's driving that process, someone who owns that. And it's typically the CEO or someone at a very high level C-suite member. But that takes real work and diligence and consistency. That's why we started Proxxy. The other thing that we find is invaluable are systems and tools that prompt and reinforce
Mhm.
that operating system. And that's why we love ResultMaps. I mean, we think it's a fantastic platform and tool. So let's talk a little bit about the need for an operating system. Do you feel like it's one of those things that like every small to medium sized business leader out there should be considering using or doing?
I think that, we can debate whether operating system is the right term to use, because I suspect like people that are coming into the workforce today are going to be like, an operating system, what's that, right? You and I remember when you used to have a CD-ROM or a floppy disk with operating system. But it's a convenient way to say there's a set of rules and procedures we're going to use in this business. And every business has them. They just may not be stated. So it's already there. It's just a question of, are you going to be intentional about it? And the degree to which you become intentional about it, and the degree to which you create it as something that can stand on its own, is the degree to which you're going to have success. So the clearer you can think about your business operating system, the more you can be intentional about it, the more success you're going to have, because you're going to have a well-oiled machine versus something that I, the founder, have to just push until I can't push anymore.
I love it. I love the intentionality, right? I mean, because you talk to people all the time who go, yeah, I've kind of, I dabbled with EOS or OKRs or Six Sigma or, whatever the flavor is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's really difficult. It's difficult to implement one. And so what are the common challenges that you see? I think intentionality that's a great starting point. But then why do people fall apart when they start putting this in motion?
You mentioned one that I want to come back to, but I'll mention three things. But the one I want to come back to is choosing one thinking it's going to apply to you because you know somebody that had it work and it doesn't work. Like, and the analogy there is like, if I was 6'7", I would play basketball very differently than I do at 5'9". Like, there's just different things I can do. There's different skill sets I have to learn. So that's one aspect, is understanding like which type and which kind of set is a good starting point for you. But the biggest number one thing I see sabotage is people, and it starts with the CEO or founder, the person at the top. Um, for better or for worse, I've seen a lot of leaders say they want to level up and do things, and then unintentionally, without awareness, just undercut it. And then they're like, I tried it, it didn't work. It's like, well, time out. I just watched you blow this up. So, I mean, that can often be it. Now, I've seen a lot of other well-intentioned CEOs and leaders that just don't understand why something isn't working. So, I mean, step one is, you as the leader, you've got to commit to it and you've got to take ownership of the outcomes. Um, that idea of extreme ownership to me is really an unlock. One of my favorite books I ever read, and it's Follow on the Dichotomy of Leadership. As the CEO or founder, you have to take ownership of the results. You don't get to delegate that away. So that's the biggest thing.
I
The
think
other,
it's funny
yeah,
that
go
you
ahead.
use the word sabotage because that's literally what they do. And, we see it all the time where top executives, they don't mean to do it, but they'll set themselves up for things going wrong, and then they get to throw on the cape and come in and be the hero. And they don't really even recognize that they're doing it. And so much of the operating system is about pushing that responsibility down into the rest of the organization so it can bubble up. And
100%. And I
yeah,
really think I think EOS, Pinnacle, all those guys would do well to put extreme ownership on their clients' reading lists, because it really gets you to go, okay, it like you basically you make an assumption every time. This is on me. If it's on me, then how do I fix it? And how do I fix it if the answer isn't scream louder? You know what I mean? Because
right.
that's what you would think. It's got Jocko Willink on the cover looking like an angry, gorilla. No offense, Jocko. I'm using Joe Rogan's terminology for you there. But and it's actually like when you read it, it's actually there's no ego, there's no bravado. It's like you've got to get the humility to change. And becoming aware of that isn't something I see. Well, what I'll say is the CEOs that I've gotten to know that are successful to a person are very good at learning and changing and adapting. And the ones that have ridden the curve all the way up to those really high levels of revenue will tell you how I managed at this stage was fundamentally different from the next stage.
Yep.
I had one person say I had to become a different person. And I think that might be an overstatement, but yeah, how you interact and what your role is does change. The other thing I see get in the way, and I get why it happens, but there's a little bit of with some of the operating systems, they come in like, okay, thou shalt to do it this way, and there will be no other way. But
Right.
sometimes they mix their own marketing interests in there, and it undermines trust in the parts that are principles based,
Mm-hmm.
because you are asking people to use certain terms sometimes over another. So when you kind of mix your business interests and the marketing in there with the principles, that undermines trust a little bit for a lot of people that have, that understand what's happening there, if that makes sense.
That's super interesting. Let's touch base on that a little bit, or dig in a little bit more on that. So one of the arguments for using a certain business operating system or management methodology or whatever term you want to use is common language,
Mm-hmm.
right? To instill and embed a common language that lets the entire organization start to work in shorthand. I
Mm-hmm.
understand when you say rocks, I know what that means. And I always think that's interesting because how many times have we sat in a room with an executive group and argued about whether something is a strategy or a tactic, or whether something is a goal or an objective, And so the simplification of what that really means was actually one of the great things about EOS.
Mm-hmm.
But
I agree.
what I'm hearing you say is that can actually, does that become inauthentic? Is that why you think that the language might be
I th-
something that could undermine the process?
I do. Think of how I want to say this. I think there are certain terms that mean the same thing. For example, like you mentioned, goal and objective. That is a fabricated, like, there's no difference between a goal and an objective. Like, they mean the same thing. It's just a question of what you do with the goal. So I like rocks. I would say, like with rocks, for example, rocks are very output based. They do not necessarily focus you on being outcome based. So I don't know. That's the wrong one for me to pick on. That's not the one I really want to pick on. I think it's where I see people get cognitive dissonance, and this is less. Yeah, I have my own sets of things that sometimes I'm like, eh. But where I see people get really frustrated, issues is one. What is an issue? Because there's an entire industry. Like, okay, everybody uses Jira, right? Jira calls everything an issue. Everything, like that's their core atomic unit in Jira is issues. So people that come out, and there's a lot of really strong leaders that come out of the technology world. So they've now got to change what issues is. And that creates dissonance versus let's just talk about the principle we're trying to get. Because if you've got a senior leader that's been like, I'll have a lot of people come to me and they're on business 2, 3, or 4. And after that experience and they've had success, they're like, okay, we're going to install stuff from day one because we know how powerful it is. But that's one of the areas where I see them just like kind of roll their eyes a little bit and be like, okay, because we can't talk about the principles behind it a little bit because we're focusing on the name of it. So I see that create some dissonance, if that makes sense.
It makes a ton of sense. And I probably shouldn't have taken us down that path, because the bigger thing that you just said was trust.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you guys have such a powerful perspective on that. But I don't want to take you off. Were there any other common issues that you see that tend to undermine the process?
I think so. One that is a hot point for me is we're coming out of a phase in the 1900s, and I'm going to say it that way purposefully, because we're next year we'll be halfway between the midpoint. The 1900s industrial era was based on a certain way of working and a certain way of leading for the first 25 years. And that basically dictated the next 75 years. People don't work that way anymore. Mm-hmm. That's not how things work, right? And, again, our kids played sports together. Like, you remember the days of like, there'd be coaches that would say in a basketball play, everybody's got to move with this exact choreography, no matter what happens. You will just do this, and then this will happen. And then they'd be pissed because something would break down or the defense reacts a different way and you can't adapt. What modern teams do is they are coached in how to make decisions. They have sets and they make decisions. And there's much more. Everybody needs to understand how we're working together. And where I'm going with this is in those older models, it's all command and control. And the way we talk about our employees changes. The way we educate them on what we're doing changes as a result. And I think that there's going to be much less tolerance for that in most industries because people have choices in where they work and people want to understand. And your ability to raise up your employees and teach them about the business is every bit as important to most people in the workforce these days as just their raw, money they're making. So I think that that's one thing that I see kind of break down when these systems become pedantic and they get into myths like personality testing and all that stuff. I mean, that's just the science behind that. There's none. And it's all been debunked by science. So what I think the good intent that the operating systems have is like, let's be intentional about how we hire and let's have the courage to fire. I don't think going and paying a ton of money to a company that's going to come give a personality test that has bad science to give you the courage to say, hey, buddy, I don't think you're going to work out here. Like, I don't think that that's good. And I don't think it creates the right dynamic for the organization to have trust. That's me on my soapbox. I'm sorry. Sorry, everybody that's in that industry.
I like it. And we could probably do 2, 3, 4 other episodes specifically on that subject. But I hear what you're saying. So let's go back to that point of trust, because I think that's you guys just did a fantastic piece on that, a series that I would recommend everybody goes to ResultMaps.com and downloads or checks out the content.
It's the math of trust. Yeah.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the math of trust.
Yeah, that came about because I, a little bit of frustration, like watching founders get in their own way, watching leaders get in their own way. And coming from a family of entrepreneurs, it's a group I'm close to, right? My father, both my grandfathers, uncles, 3 of my cousins, like we're a family of entrepreneurs, and my father's friends were all entrepreneurs. And I'd see some people hit a ceiling, under 10 million. I'd see some people go further. And I think the things that hold people back are avoidable. And one of the things that holds people back is they kill trust with 1,000 paper cuts. And when I thought about like explaining to people why it's so important to adopt the practices that we put in place with ResultMaps or any business operating system, a lot of it does come down to trust. Yes, you're going to build more enterprise value in your business if you have a system that's documented so that you're selling the business. But from a principle standpoint, whatever your goals are, you're going to be more resilient. You're going to be able to handle what comes up better, and stuff is going to happen. Like there's no plan. Like long-term planning has been debunked. You know, even Mike Tyson is appropriating quotes from 19th century Prussian generals. You know, no, every plan, what is it? Every plan falls apart when you get punched in the face. That's Mike Tyson, you know, quoting or paraphrasing a Prussian general from the 19th century. That planning stuff doesn't work. Where am I going with this, Bryon? I guess what I'm trying to get to is I was looking for a way to explain to people why these little things are so important. And if you'll do these little things, the trust is there. And when we talk about trust, I've also seen people erode it with all these paper cuts, and then they'll go do like a big thing. We're going to go do trust falls or have an incredible event, or we're going to send people nice stuff. They do all these things that are sort of peripheral to make up for the ways they're breaking trust. And I'm a big believer in like gamifying things. Some of this stuff is boring. You know, it's boring to make 100 free throws, but you can be a better shooter if you do that every day. So how can we gamify the things that build trust? And how can we take some of the things that might otherwise just be like, I don't know if I feel like doing this today, and make it like, no, I got to do it because it's part of ensuring there's trust on my team. And guess what? When you do those things, you tend to get results way faster at way lower cost.
So do you think, you know, it's interesting you talked about gamification, because there's a lot of people who feel like gamification is the ultimate inauthentic experience. And so I agree, you know, that small measures create large measures, and so, or large results. And so I, I, I think I'm in the camp that does believe that anything that you can do that helps give data on small levels and inspires people to keep doing things, I think that's really smart. Um, but I do think it's, you know, if that's done wrong, that can also really erode trust, right? Just like you were saying, like the wrong
Oh yeah.
words.
Yeah, if
So,
it feels inauthentic and marketing-y, that's why we don't have we don't actually measure trust points right now in ResultMaps. We've offered that to people as a way to think about trust. And whether you're
right.
using ResultMaps or not, give yourself a mental point every time you do it. Like, and that's
Because if you're not measuring, it's just a hobby, right?
yeah. I mean, and in terms of it working or not working, like I've gotten into cycling. Man, that's how I get through it. It's like, okay, I'm gonna set this milestone, just get to that milestone and reassess. I'm gonna get to this next one and reassess, right? And
Yeah.
you sort of like you can negotiate with the negative parts of your brain to get you to that next point if you've got some little mental lever. And when I've talked with and worked closely with great leaders, great founders, great CEOs, most of them have a way they do that. Some of them, you know, are very engineering and that's not how they think of it. But I think even for those guys, they're seeing it as an engineering problem. And business isn't engineering. It's not. That's how they gamify it because they like engineering problems. You know, there's an aspect of engineering to it. And there's a lot we can learn from engineering it. But we need these mental hooks. Otherwise, it's like, why do I have to go to this particular meeting? Why do I have to run this particular meeting a particular way? Well, we're going to do it this way so that we can save people from the challenges that are out there. And make no mistake, Bryon, people are stressed out and overwhelmed. And, you know, we do hundreds and hundreds of one-on-one onboardings. And when we do intake for customers, and we'll ask them like what their biggest concerns are. And on the front lines, what we hear from everybody is, well, like, I mean, I get a priority list and it's changed by the next week. And then I'm still held accountable for it. But like, no, like, I don't feel like anybody's paying any attention to all the work that's getting heaped on my plate. And I think that there's and then so that erodes trust. And then the leaders are like, what are they whining about? They shouldn't be whining. It's like, well, they're not actually whining. They're just asking you to give them clearer guidance and take ownership if you're getting in the way. Like, and they're confusing those issues, and that's avoidable.
But doesn't that come from planning? Like you talked about the fact that planning is debunked or doesn't make sense. Don't you have to have that long-term vision and be committed to the long-term vision so that others can kind of understand how to work behind that? And then also keep yourself from, shiny,
100%. But there's a difference between that and planning. So like if you have a plan, if we think of like a game plan, everybody loves playbooks and football analogies, and I'm going to cut right to the heart of that because the way most people talk about it has nothing to do with how they're used in football. A game plan in football has a set of very specific things you're going to try to do to exploit weaknesses in the other team. It is not like the coaches don't go in with every play laid out. They go in prepared for different scenarios. Like that's what they practice all week. They plan for different scenarios. So you have the numbers you're trying to hit and you have things you do for the scenarios, but it's not one Gantt chart that you're following. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So they will come in with the first 20 plays, the first 30 plays, because they want to see how the other team reacts to that. But that's all part of a larger plan, right? The scenario planning after that is 100% correct.
I mean, they're much smaller chunks that get changed out earlier. I don't think it's 20 plays. It's like a couple series, it's a couple series they're making. And 49ers coach Bill Walsh wrote about this in The Score Takes Care of Itself. He's a pioneer of this way of thinking. He'd come into the game, you'd come in with certain things, but everything he set his people up to make decisions, and he was ready to make decisions quickly. Where planning goes bad, and what I mean to distinguish planning, you've got to have your things that are set in stone you're driving toward. Then you have to say no to everything else, right? No, I'm not going to do that because you said this is the priority. Or if you want me to do that, you have to teach people how to say, okay, that's me doing this other thing you just mentioned is going to get in the way of me doing this other thing we said is a priority. Just make that intentional. But where planning goes wrong is we've taken the idea of coming up with a budget and financial goals and then backing out that as a plan as though we know what's going to happen in the future. And while the budgeting is a useful activity and diligence in budgeting and financial management is a useful activity, it always fails. If you treat that as a plan, it always fails. That's why you have
if it's in concrete.
Yeah. So you have to have like clear targets and be flexible in how you get the outcomes.
So that's an interesting subject. How do we, if we are constantly reevaluating, how does an organization, or how should an organization reevaluate their own business operating system?
Okay. Well, I'll say two things. Like you have a cadence on which you're reevaluating. That's what keeps the chaos out. So if you're reevaluating goals like an EOS, they like a 90-day world. For earlier stage or faster moving companies, we think 6 weeks is more, is what you ought to be doing if you're in like tech and it's moving super fast, or you're a venture-backed startup and growth is really important. But that said, reevaluating your business operating system, I think depends on one, have you adopted it? Like, how are things going is where I'm going to start. Like, how are things going for you? Are you hitting your targets consistently? If you are, you may not need to change. But good, we'll keep on going. On the other hand, things tend to start to slow down. Like what gets you here won't get you there in certain ways. The things that help a company get to that first million, maybe even the first couple million, will totally hamstring you from getting to 10. Right? At 1 million and 2 million, you're just trying everything. But then you have to stabilize and start to double down. Getting from 10 to 50 that's a good place to take stock of what your goals are and how you're getting there. And really, I think it's between, I'd say 8 and 50 that businesses will have the most success, like coming in hard with a business operating system. When you're farther down that path, the operating systems change. Like you mentioned, Lean Six Sigma, that requires you to have figured out your business. Like your business has to have a level of maturity. Otherwise, you're going to be adapting too slow and you're putting a bunch of overhead on it. So that's really not even appropriate until you're much larger. But yeah, I'd say at these inflection points, for sure at 10 million, maybe at 5 if you're starting to see your growth slow. I see a lot of organizations kind of between 5 and 8. Things start to slow down, and or the leadership team or the founders getting like their quality of life starting to suffer. Those are great times to reevaluate what's happening. Like when your life is, if you feel like your life is kind of falling apart or your business is taking over your life, it's definitely a great time to reevaluate.
Yeah, and that's usually when people call Proxxy too, but we see it on employee count.
Yeah,
You
I
know,
think that's the
10
other
employees,
thing.
25 employees, 50 employees, 150 employees. Those are, anytime you're going through those are such massive shifts for most organizations
100%.
that the operating system sometimes can hamstring you. So I think that makes sense as well.
I think that's 100% true, because I've seen so many companies go on these growth spurts and hire people and then very quickly have to let them all go
Yeah,
because
right.
they haven't done it systematically.
Right. They didn't have a platform for scaling that would let them keep moving. And I also asked that question about reevaluation because what is the math behind? What's the formula behind trust that you talk
Oh,
about?
right. Yeah. So I got it from a Steve Sarkisian press conference, right? Trust is
Yeah.
time plus consistency. And yeah, it's something that unfortunately people aren't, it's easy if you think about it and just keep things that way. It forces you to simplify. It forces you to build trust and to make it simple. And you don't get an out on that. You have to stay consistent.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Scott, this has been fantastic. I knew it would be. I love your hot take opinions, the on different subjects around this, and I know you've done your homework. So, um, just as a last piece of advice for these business leaders who are small to medium-sized business owners that are scaling their business and they're going through those inflection points, um, is there anything else they should be considering as they're thinking about implementing or installing a business operating system?
Yeah, I do think Extreme Ownership is a great book. Number one. Number
Mhm.
two, I embrace the systems. I don't try to, so there may be things that systems will state that I know are false, like a personality test is a big one. But like I'm adopting the system, right? I studied Taekwondo. It doesn't mean every single thing out of every ranking belt's mouth is something I'm going to take 100%. But I understand that with each of these systems, you're getting the pros and cons. So go ahead and embrace the system and work on installing it correctly. Um, the third thing I'd say is when you're choosing a system, don't just go because your buddy did it and it worked for them. Like go beyond social proof. Try to understand the principles and when different systems are appropriate. What the research that's out there, right? The research that all the systems quote, Jim Collins. It's like it doesn't so much matter how beautiful your vision is. It just matters that you have one. And it matters that you pay attention to how you're executing on it and improve that. Whether you choose one system or another, the fact that you've chosen that and become intentional about it, it's like diets, right? I think just when you start looking at your nutrition intake, it changes things immediately. I think we've talked about that before. And so I think
Sure.
business operating systems are the same way. Becoming intentional about how you run your business, you're going to get a lift.
I love it. So insightful, Scott. Thanks again for being on the leaders list.
My pleasure. Appreciate you having me.